So in part three, we're going to talk about designers, and we'll continue on our American thread. Here you're looking at Donna Karan. She studied at Parsons, and she did this really important collection in 1985 called Seven Easy Pieces, where it was mix and match kind of separates. A little bit of like what you're seeing here in her Donna Karan 1999 collection. She has a diffusion line called DKNY, which you see on the left, which is a lot more athleisure oriented. She got on the bandwagon, a model going down the runway in tennis shoes. Ooh. Okay. Ralph Lauren continues to be huge, I mean, through to this day, and there's a really great HBO documentary on him called Very Ralph that I highly recommend to all of you. But Ralph likes to go in, do classics, but also raid history. But as you can see on the right, he was also swayed by that slip dressing trend in the 90s as well. Norma Kamali we discussed in the 1980s, but she continues on. She's still got her business running. And she loves Jersey, Jersey, Jersey. So this is a continuation of her athleisure looks that she started way back in the 80s. Marc Jacobs, another American designer, starts his label in 1993, but before that he's designing for Perry Ellis, as we saw for grunge. So he starts there in 1998 first. He also ends up designing for Louis Vuitton from 97 to 2014, but what I want you to know about him is he raids fashion history. Everything is a historical reference, and he's even been sued for knocking off people in the past. But that is his treasure trove, fashion history, and he just takes the past and amplifies it and exaggerates it. So we looked at Betsey Johnson in the context of the 1960s. Remember, she was working way back in the 60s for the New York store called Paraphernalia, and she's going strong in the 90s with this sort of punk rock meets little girl kind of a look, very girly look, and on the grungy side, but leaning way toward more toward the feminine. So now we're going to look at the more avant-garde designers in the 90s. So the Antwerp Six were Martin Margiela, Anne de Meulemeester, Dirk Bickenberg, Dries Van Noten, Walter van Beirendonck, and Marina Yee. So they all went to school at the Royal Academy of Art in Antwerp. And they all, debuted in the late 80s, and they all did different things. But I'm just going to look at two of them who I feel like have had, or three of them that have had like the most success and are the most well known. The first is Anne de Meulemeester. So she launches her first line in '86 in Paris, and makes classical designs, right? You can see it, but deconstructs them and plays with scale, loves black and white, loves the singer Patti Smith. So Dries Van Noten, we looked at him a little earlier. I mean, no other designer sort of exemplifies global fashion besides him and Gaultier, really, Jean-Paul Gaultier. You're really seeing the sarong here again, the sarong being just a rectangle of fabric wrapped around the waist and tied. This is also demonstrating this big trend for wearing skirts over pants, which is directly derived from Indian and Pakistani dress. So probably the most controversial and experimental of the Antwerp Six was Martin Margiela, and he created a fashion house called Maison Martin Margiela, Maison meaning house in French. And this guy, not only is he deconstructing, but he was actually sending pieces down the runway made out of pattern paper that weren't even fabricated in a textile. So you can see that on the left. Also, if you notice the vest on the left, it's actually simulating a dress form, the muslin of a dress form, and it has the imprint of a dress form on as well, which you can see on the right. Also on the right is traditional basting for tailoring, which you do with a white thread to contrast it on a dark ground. So he really broke apart um, fashion in a radical way. And also all the people in his design house were completely anonymous and wore white coats. These are just a couple more looks from Maison um, Martin Margiela. Shoes that had no uppers, right? It would just stick to your feet. Very experimental. So we'll take a quick look at the Japanese designers we introduced in the 1980s. Yohji Yamamoto continues on. You can see sort of how he toes sort of it's really classic lines, and then he's playing with the draping and the construction possibilities here. Issey Miyake is another one of the very important 1980s Japanese designers. He starts his Pleats Please line in 1993, and here are a couple of looks. I mean, the one on the left we looked at before in the 80s, but he starts this experimentation with pleats, but then he creates a whole line that continues to this day. Rei Kawakubo continues strong into the 90s and through till today. And this particular collection was also known as the Lumps and Bumps collection. It got a lot of criticism for referencing disabilities, people with disabilities. But I really love how I felt like she was looking as much at the negative space around the body as the actual garment itself as a concept. And also I loved how she used this really cheery checked gingham in a really serious questioning of the structure of Western garments. So the House of Prada has been in existence since 1913, but Miuccio Prada took over in the late 70s, and really you should know Prada. Prada's so ubiquitous, meaning everywhere. So Miuccio Prada just loves the idea of like taking ugly things and making them into luxury fashion. That little check coat, that pattern just spread everywhere in the 90s. But she's referring here to like textiles from the 1950s in these particular looks. So here are a couple more examples of Prada looks, and I mean, reflecting minimalism of the 90s, and also that layering of sheers with solids and patterns. That backpack Miuccio Prada designs in 1978, and it's a huge hit. In the 90s, it was gigantic and all knocked off on Canal Street with that signature triangular logo. Gianni Versace launches his line Versace in 1978, but he's really cooking in the 90s. And on the right, you see his signature black with gold style, sort of S&M bondage reference looks. This is very iconic for that line. He, I didn't mention, but like maxi skirts are a big deal in the 90s. You saw them everywhere. And here are a couple of evening dresses that Versace did also. Sexed up like they usually are, or tarted up, as some people say. And by the way, he was assassinated in 1997. There's a documentary out on Netflix about that. Tom Ford, who was relatively unknown, goes to design for the Italian company Gucci, and he's there in 1994, and he pretty much turns around the company, makes these sleek velvet suits, and combines luxurious like satins with velvets, but looks and very high quality tailoring and narrow silhouette. This is a few looks by Helmut Lang. He's an Austrian designer. He opens his line in 1986, and he's a self-taught fashion designer. But you can see that really elegant, very high luxury minimalism that he is known for. I included this slide because there's a lot of faux materials that happen in the 1990s. So this is actually an artist who made this suit, but well, Hugo Boss made it, and they made out of it. I made it out of Tyvek, which you know is this really sturdy protective material. But there's a lot of that kind of surreal um, manipulation of textiles, fake meaning faked fabric. Vivienne Westwood continues to go strong in the 1990s, and here are three pieces from her Anglomania collection. So Anglo meaning Anglomania is a direct reference to the late um, 1700s passion by the French of English things. So she's talking about historic menswear tailoring that she's applying to women's wear, and she's also deconstructing by on the far right, you know, that combination of pastiche of a lot of things, like a Scottish kilt belt and a wraparound sweater and a multitude of patterns, but also playing with the textiles in different places. John Galliano is Spanish, but he studied in London. He first designs for Dior starting in 1996, and he ended his career there in 2011, very traumatically. You can look that up. But look at what he's doing. He's taking evening wear and deconstructing it on the right, literally making a gown where you see the interior corset. So this is really the 90s expression, deconstructive expression that we're seeing sort of as a theme through a lot of designers' work. On the left is a real direct reference to 1930s fashion. So here's a really resplendent John Galliano. He was extremely important for his evening wear looks, his over-the-top abundance in couture designs, because he's doing the top of the haute couture. He's at the top of the shelf for that. And he loved history. He's always making deliberate references to history. So here you're seeing something that references 1700s dress. So Alexander McQueen attends Central St. Martin's in London, and he studies on Savile Row tailoring techniques. And this is my favorite aspect of his work, or his tailored pieces, because they're amazing and really float my boat, so to speak. He's the head designer for Givenchy from 1996 to 2001, and then he starts his own line, and his works were always heavily conceptualized. So the Highland Rape collection that you see on the left was not about women being raped, although he portrayed them in states of duress, suggesting it, but he was talking about how Scotland had been ravaged by England politically and militarily.